The Lever. Subscriber-supported journalism that holds power accountable. As a Lever Premium subscriber, you'll get to hear exclusive bonus content from this episode and others in your feed. To become a subscriber, go to levernews.com.
From the Lever's reader-supported newsroom, this is Lever Time. I'm David Sirota. Have you ever thought to yourself in the last few years, where did everything go? When it comes to brick and mortar stuff in our communities, the disappearances have been apparent for decades. Independent stores, whether they sell food or books, have been vanishing. Beloved neighborhood restaurants have been forced to close. But that trend also extends to the media we consume. In journalism, the media is, to put it mildly, in a state of crisis. In the past year, outlets like BuzzFeed News have completely shut down, while bedrocks of journalism like the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, the Los Angeles Times, and NPR have gutted their newsrooms. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. Regional newspapers, once the bedrock of their communities, have become shells of their glorious past. And private equity firms have torn them down and sold off the parts in an effort to get rich. That's not to say there isn't some hope. Some outlets, like The Lever, have been able to grow and expand during this period of turmoil, and a new crop of independent journalists have been able to build major audiences by connecting directly with their readers. But do those gains negate the fact that we're losing more and more journalists? Is this new media environment able to sustain the kind of rigorous investigative reporting that we've long taken for granted? And just what is the lesson of this moment? Today on Lever Time, I'm going to sit down with Ben Smith. He's the co-founder and editor-in-chief of Semafor. And before that, he was the media columnist for the New York Times and the editor-in-chief of BuzzFeed News. Back in the day, some of the best journalism in the country came from local newspapers. Papers like the San Jose Mercury News or the Anchorage Daily News, or my two hometown newspapers, the Philadelphia Inquirer and the Philadelphia Daily News. Up until the mid-2000s, regional newspapers had the means to be powerhouses in their communities, and they could afford to give reporters the space to dig into what was going on in places that don't often attract the attention of national outlets. In 1995, the Raleigh News and Observer published an exposé on the dangers of the state's hog industry, leading to big reforms. 5 years later in Ohio, the Dayton Daily News exposed malpractice that revealed a lack of accountability by the state's medical board. Perhaps one of the more well-known examples of this was the Boston Globe's 2002 investigation into the Catholic Church's efforts to cover up sexual abuse by priests, an investigation that was memorialized by the movie Spotlight.
It could have been you. It could have been me. It could have been any of us. We gotta nail these scumbags. We gotta show people that nobody can get away with this. Not a priest or a cardinal or a freaking pope.
This culture of local shoe leather reporting was memorialized in one of my favorite films of all time, The Paper. It was memorialized in that scene where Michael Keaton, the editor of the gritty local newspaper, hustles to get a huge scoop and then tells off his competitor on the national desk of the New York Times.
You just blew your chance to cover the world!
Really? Well, guess fucking what? I don't really fucking care. You wanna know fucking why? Because I don't fucking live in the fucking world! I live in fucking New York City! So go fuck yourself!
But today, that kind of local news hustle, all that competition for scoops and revelations that better inform the public, all of that is experiencing a slow death. When news went digital, these outlets lost their ad revenue and, to some people, their relevance. Large papers like the Boston Globe struggled to adapt to an era of belt-tightening, and if they weren't bought by a private equity firm or a billionaire, other papers just closed altogether. Now, Northwestern University estimates that more than half of the counties in America have either limited or no access to local news coverage. What's that mean to you? Well, for one thing, it means more corruption. One study found that when local newspapers close, it means higher borrowing costs for the local governments. Politicians basically give away more public money to Wall Street, knowing there's no local newspaper to nail them on it. Another study found a rise in federal corruption charges when major newspapers close in a community. In other words, without local news coverage, corruption becomes so flagrant and rampant and out of control that the feds step in. And you can bet for every one time the feds do step in, there are 10 examples of more petty corruption going unreported, unnoticed, and unprosecuted. Corruption and a lack of insight about your community is one problem of the death of local news. But even national outlets can't seem to figure out how to stay afloat. The Washington Post, one of the most recognizable newspapers in the world, one that's owned by one of the world's wealthiest men, has been laying off staff for years. Most recently, they shrunk their newsroom by 240 people. Time magazine, owned by the billionaire Mark Benioff, also cut their staff. So did the billionaire-owned Los Angeles Times and Wall Street Journal. If it wasn't bad enough that billionaires were buying up papers throughout the country, what feels even worse is that billionaires are allowing journalism to die while they've generated historic amounts of wealth for themselves. Yes, it's true. Major media outlets have made many mistakes, and there is much to criticize about what they choose to cover and how they cover it. It's something that we cover extensively here at The Lever. But it should also be acknowledged that many of these papers have produced journalism that inspired positive reforms in government and society. Today, journalism, and I mean real journalism, not op-eds or hot takes that are written in reaction to the news, but actual reporting, the kind that can hold the powerful accountable. That kind of journalism requires tenacity, time, and resources, and it's becoming harder to find. That's not to say it's completely dead. Some bigger outlets are still producing deeply reported pieces, and smaller, more nimble outfits like The Lever are trying to fill the void. And we're growing, thanks to our paying subscribers. But still, will that be enough to fill the ever-growing hole that's being created by the hollowing out of the news industry in the name of profit? To answer that question, I called up journalist and Semafor founder Ben Smith, who I've known for years. Recently, Ben launched a podcast called Mixed Signals, and every week he tries to answer some of these same questions. Chiefly, what is happening to the media today? Ben also wrote the recent book about the life and death of online journalism outlets called Traffic: Genius, Rivalry, and Delusion in the billion-dollar race to go viral. Ben and I don't agree on everything, but Ben's time as an editor, a reporter, and now the founder of a news outlet has allowed him to see the media industry from almost every angle. As the former editor-in-chief of BuzzFeed, for example, he played a major role in transforming a wacky internet startup into a place that was home to Pulitzer Prize-winning journalism. Now you may be asking, why does any of this matter? Why are we talking about this? It matters because journalism is a fundamental part of a functioning democracy. Without it, we as citizens are deprived of the ability to actually hold the centers of power accountable. And the media, even in a period of turmoil, is incredibly influential. And when it changes, that surely has downstream effects on the rest of our society. So now, here's my conversation with Ben Smith. Let's start with where we are right now. What is your basic assessment of why so many major media outlets shuttered or underwent huge job cuts in the last, year, 16 months, 18 months? I mean, it's been ongoing for a while, but it does feel like something accelerated in that time period.
Well, first of all, per our previous discussion, I would like to take this slot to plug my new podcast.
Please. Please.
But seriously, I'm not paying you for it, but I would. Which is about a lot of these questions, called Mixed Signals from Semafor.
Yeah.
But I do think, and the reason we launched it is because you see these things in media and you can't figure out why they are happening, from what's promoted where, but also too, right, like what is going on in news and why are there all these closures? And there's an impulse, I think, and journalists loved a good monocausal explanation. And so there was a great line in the New Yorker that this was an extinction level event for media. But I actually think what's happening, there are a couple different things happening in media. And 3/4 of it, in a certain way of speaking, is very positive. There are a lot of new things. There are a lot of small and medium-sized outlets like yours and mine on totally different lanes, trying to figure things out, trying to figure out new models. There are trade publications of all sorts just absolutely thriving. We're in a golden age of niche publications. If you want news about Capitol Hill or about the waste management industry or about a million other things, it's never been better. And there's a lot of national political coverage, national investigative reporting. And all of that is just subsumed in this massive wave that is the collapse of local news in America, and which erases all those gains and way more. And so in a way, there are two different stories. And one is lots of interesting green shoots and leaves, but the bigger one is just that local is still collapsing. What happened this year? Part of it was that some billionaires who had bailed out local publications a few years ago got bored and were like, this is annoying. I'm still losing money. And that was what happened in Los Angeles. That's to some degree what happened in Washington. And the struggles of local news, and I would say in the United States, it's actually not a global phenomenon, it's an American phenomenon, are, they're so dire.
The threat of billionaires getting bored is as much a threat as billionaires steering the news, right? I mean, I think like there's the billionaire Citizen
Kane. It might be the same phenomenon, actually.
Yeah. I mean, there's the Citizen Kane who is the billionaire using the news to for their political agenda, and then there's the billionaire who like dabbles like a little bit and then pulls out and creates. There's no media stability when that happens. But I would also ask about the other factor, which is private equity, hedge funds, the financialization of at least part of the news. Tell us your thoughts of that. I mean, when you hear about that, I mean, I'm talking to you from Denver, right? Denver people think about hedge fund news. They think about the Denver Post and the thinning out of the Denver Post at the hands of a hedge fund owner. What is all of that about? Do you think we're coming to the end of that era? I mean, how much money is there left for them to squeeze out of media?
I mean, let me give my priors here, which is I'm a person who often when I read the Lever, I think, you know what? This is capitalism at work. God bless creative destruction. If the car wash industry or the veterinary industry is getting consolidated, maybe it's for the better. Who knows? I think that this is a case where the consolidation and the sort of these chains, basically these chains in the early 2000s, Gannett, McClatchy, and then Alden being sort of the worst and bottom feeder of them, took on all this debt to buy up what I guess they thought at the time, although somebody should have told them otherwise, were going to be great businesses. And they were going to create these big consolidated businesses where they could share back ends and printing plants and they could produce great newspapers. They weren't thinking our business is collapsing and we're going out of business. They were thinking, let's borrow some money so we can build big businesses. And it was just an absolute catastrophe. And these companies took on debt that they couldn't handle in a declining industry, particularly after 2008, and are in just various stages on the, circling the drain. And it's a specifically American story. It is not what happened in Asia. It's not what happened in Europe, where you have chains, but they're family owned, and are very focused on stability and continuity. It's just like we got into this death spiral of debt and mismanagement and unfunded pension liabilities and very little help from the government, specifically with the pension liabilities. That produce these zombie newspapers all over the country, and it's just a total disaster.
If there is an American exceptionalism story here, that we stand out, our media dystopia stands out from other countries, other societies. Why do you think that is?
I mean, I'm with you on this one. I think it was this rush to financialize and to this opportunity to borrow money at a huge scale and culture of, and then particularly in the later stages, figuring out that the real estate assets were more valuable than anything else and milking them. I think the newspapers industry is like the poster child for the Lever. I disagree with you on a lot of the other ones, but I'm just totally with you on this one.
Yeah. Well, I then would ask, where do you think we're headed? Or give us the two branches. There's like the Back to the Future 2. They fly ahead to the future, and it's like a complete dystopia. And then by the end of Back to the Future 2, where they've fixed everything, there's the fly ahead to the future, and everything's better.
Yeah.
So give us the two branches in your mind.
I mean, let's see. I think that there are these huge challenges that don't really have to do with news that overlay this. A collapse in trust in institutions of all sorts. And so, and I don't think that the news business caused that or it's going to fix it. It's obviously this huge macro social trend. I think when it comes to local news, the best case is sustainable local companies that are some mix of for-profit and nonprofit, and a lot of them are, for-profit corporations that don't make any money, or nonprofit corporations that are actually very well run and turn a profit, just don't return it to shareholders. Like I think those models aren't as different as people say. But companies that are run, ultimately for the benefit of the city, not because it's the best business in the world, and that rebuild, never the scale of the old Indianapolis Star, where I started out, that had hundreds and hundreds of reporters. Like there's just not a business model for that. And the amount of money you'd have to extract from the local wealthy donors to build a paper on that scale, you would regret. You'd be working for them to too great a degree. But I think there is an opportunity to rebuild, but ultimately still on a smaller scale, in the best case, this kind of ground level local information ecosystem, which can feed up to the national publications. And I think part of what you see now is we just live in this kind of fantasy land where there's so little reporting happening on the ground in localities that people get their information about what's happening in the country from 4-second clips on social media of somebody punching somebody. And no local reporter ever went out and figured out what happened. I mean, I think even like you saw around some of the campus protests, there was a weird lack outside college newspapers, which are a funny little niche, of just okay, what is happening? Who are these people? When that guy was hitting that other guy with a stick, who were they? And there was just this sort of strange absence of that.
So here's what I worry about, whether I would actually put into this discussion, there's local news that's not happening or is being hollowed out. There's also longer form, deep dive, longer lead time investigative reporting that takes, a lot of time and resources. These are both, I think, business challenges. And what I worry about is a media, there's the corporatization of media, but there's also this, we live in an information ecosystem where essentially what we're saying is that local media and or deep dive, long form, expensive investigative journalism is hard to get a return on investment, is hard to make financially sustainable. So there's this kind of baked in incentive to do shorter form, more shallow, kind of clicky news. I'm using clicky as kind of not to say it's all vapid, but it's just as a placeholder. And I worry that we get to a point where everything is surface level and none of the either hyper local or deep dive stuff actually gets done because it's simply not a good business decision necessarily to fund it. Is that a world we're going to live in? And I feel like there's a lot of downsides of that world.
Well, if it's any consolation, the clicky stuff is also going out of business too. But AI is going to do that for you. I think, big investigative reporting was in some ways always a luxury of a really great business. And the best of the great newspaper investigative reporting of the 70s, 80s, 90s was from places like the Toledo Blade. Was a product of the fact that Toledo Blade was an amazing business, printing money, which they could go give to Mike Salla to go dig up Vietnam War crimes. But there are new. I think that the national investigative reporting is probably more of it than there's ever been. ProPublica is this unbelievable juggernaut. There's this whole new culture and model of nonprofit investigative journalism that, I would say maybe even a little more than the old newspaper journalism does bring with it a bit of, this is what we raised the money to do, and we kind of know who the good guys are and the bad guys are, and we're going to go get them, which can be good and can be bad, but is not, it's a model that, like every model, and comes with some challenges, but ultimately is pretty amazing. And I think it's just the notion that news is an appropriate object for philanthropy is new and has brought hundreds of millions of dollars, particularly into long-form investigative reporting. Sometimes the challenge of, will anybody read it? Where does it go? How does it have an impact if nobody reads it? Is a big and kind of unsolved challenge. Because of course, part of the power of those newspapers was not only did they produce this crazy investigation, they then just like shoved it in front of everybody in Toledo over breakfast.
Yeah, I mean, I've said this before, which is that my concern is that there's more and more opinion riffing on, hot taking on less and less journalism, less and less certainly long form or deep dive investigative journalism. And I agree with you. There's still great investigative journalism being done, but I'm like kind of concerned about there's like more and more noise about less and less substance, if you will, and where that ultimately leads us. I don't really know, because I understand that the business of journalism rewards the cheapest possible product in a lot of ways. I mean, it's easier it's less of a risk to try to monetize things that you're not spending a lot on. And so what do we end up with? Lots of opinions, not that much reporting. I mean, talk me off the ledge here.
I mean, I will not. But I do, and because I also think that, the one thing that I think is basically positive is there's a proliferation of new models. There are kind of digital subscription businesses like yours. There are niche advertising businesses like mine. There are a bunch of people trying new things. But I think that news gathering, in some ways, when we were launching Semafor, part of what we were thinking about was how do you create a model that is built, that's sort of a Substack-like model for great beat reporters, but and I think you guys are vanishingly unusual in doing a lot of original journalism in a subscription model. And it's because you found a lane where people are really passionate about what you're covering, and because you have a point of view that you bring to stuff that your audience kind of at some very broad, appropriately broad level buys into. If you're like us and you're trying, but there is this question of like an individual reporter who just likes to go out and break news. That's not a Substack, because one day they're talking about this, the next day they're talking about that. One day they're beating up on the person you love, the next day the person you hate. Like it doesn't lend itself to that. And so, and by the way, they need lawyers and editors
for sure,
and a team. And so, I mean, when we were building Semafor, we were definitely thinking like, how do you create the best of Substack, which is say that kind of very direct, honest, open connection to an audience, with the best of an old newsroom, which is a level of support, a brand, an ability to not necessarily tell your audience what they want to hear all the time, because sometimes the facts don't match that. And I think that was sort of the beauty of the old ad-supported newspaper business that I think people like you and me are like in our different ways really straining to rebuild.
And look, I just want to add, I do not think, and there are good Substacks out there, but I have been somebody who has passionately believed that Substack, or the sort of individual reporter going their own way, is it's fine, but that's not the solution because of what you just said. Like, institutions are necessary to do real journalism by virtue of the fact that you need editorial support. You need legal support, especially when you're doing accountability journalism. You need the basic structure of an organization to do all the things to make journalism possible at a scale. That's my view. So I don't think...
Yeah, and sometimes you need time. Sometimes you need to say, I'm not going to write this week because I'm chasing a story. Hey, can you take over for me? And there's got to be somebody on the other end of that conversation.
Exactly. I would ask you then the additional question about media institutions. It feels like right now it's like a moment where the practitioners of institutional objectivity, and I'm putting that in quotes, institutional objectivity are finding themselves in some ways at odds with a larger and larger segment of the public. The public skepticism of institutions generally redounds to journalism organizations specifically. We can't trust this or that organization. And I think one of the questions that comes up is, how much do you think that has to do with the entities themselves purporting to be objective, but people sensing that they're not, people sensing that they're not being honest about that? I mean, I will preface this question by saying my view is that I think there's fair and accurate journalism. I actually don't necessarily think there's any such thing as objectivity. Once you decide that something is a story and other things are not a story, you're making a subjective decision. And I just wonder if you think that kind of old school voice of God, institutional objectivity, that people suspect that's not what's really going on.
It's funny. I think we should not get derailed into a conversation about what the word objectivity means, but because it is a long-running discussion in journalism. But I do think that sentiment that you identified, like I also sort of feel and see everywhere so acutely, which is that sense of, like, this isn't totally on the level. This article in a great publication that I respect by a journalist I like, I'm still going to go and Google a couple other versions of the same story and kind of triangulate what happened. And I think there are different parts of the challenge and different ways to solve it. One part of it is just that an article is a set of facts, some analysis, some point of view, and the tradition in American media is to roll all those together. So the lead of the article is sort of who, what, when, where, why statement of facts. Then you have a statement of analysis that comes from kind of nowhere. Then you quote a professor at a prestigious university saying whatever you actually think. Then you have some more analysis that may be total bullshit. That's the nut graph. But again, purporting to be fact, I think. And at no point do you say, by the way, here's who I am and where I'm coming from, which isn't to say either your, gender, racial identity necessarily, or not to say I'm a Democrat, I'm a Republican, but is to kind of say, hey, I've covered this for a while. I used to work at one of these companies. And like when I did this interview with Vivek Ramaswamy the other day, where it's like, and when he's talking about finance, the guy really seems to know what he's talking about. But when he was talking about how to run a media company, a thing I have done, like he definitely does not know what he's talking about. And that's, and I don't need to quote some professor saying that. And particularly like good experienced reporters are often really, really expert on kind of key elements of the stuff they cover. And so just actually being able to be honest about that expertise really matters. I mean, it's less, but the problem, there's also a challenge, which is that if I got to the beat yesterday, you shouldn't care about my opinion or where I'm coming from, really. But I think there's just a sort of, there's like just a kind of bullshit quality to the way media is produced that I think the audience rightly detects, like, hey, who's saying this? And, and you can try to fix it in different ways. I think you try to be very authentic about where you're coming from. We try to kind of separate news and opinion and bring in dissenting views, essentially, including if they disagree with us. But I do think trying to just level with the audience is so important.
I think that's key, and I want to echo that. I do think there are different ways to do it. I think the way we at The Lever do it, for instance, is I don't think there's any mystery around what our basic mission is, what our basic premise is, and essentially who I am as the person who has founded it and run it. Like there's no mystery there, right? So. And I think the way you guys do it, I actually will commend you on that I do feel like I get to know the reporters a little bit every time I read them, because they've got and for those who haven't read Semafor, there's this part where I think it's all their articles, they have a kind of section where the reporter does some reporting and then says what their view is, which I think is like actually helpful. I don't think it spoils the reporting. I think it actually feels more transparent. By that I mean in a good way. Like I see where you're coming from. You're not giving me voice of God, because voice of God is what makes me suspicious, right? Like that's actually, I've told a couple friends I know at some big publications that I have problems with their sort of political coverage, where they state things, they make ideological statements as factual news statements, as if it's coming from the voice of God. And on certain issues that I'm sort of read into, studied into, I know it's bullshit, right? I know it's at least not a binary fact. So I really appreciate the way you guys do it. I would ask you the question that always comes up in all of these models, the question of purity. This is an important question. I think that doesn't get a lot of discussion, which is there's a model that's totally subscriber funded. There are models that are a mix of subscriber funded and philanthropic donor funded. The philanthropic donors may have their motives. There's a model of where you add into the portfolio business funding, corporate funding, and people have the concern that any model that's one click impure, putting that in quotes, not just straight up reader supported, makes the news content impure. What's your response to that? How do you think people should think about that?
I mean, I think that, subscribers are another source of impurity. I mean, Jesus threw the money changers out of the temple, right? Like, I think that ultimately revenue, is the lifeblood of any company, and we pay our reporters, and every model leads itself, has risks. That an advertiser could get mad and push you to do, and if you, and threaten to pull ads and push you in one direction, that by alienating your subscribers, you could hurt your business. This is actually specifically happening right now. There's a slice of the conservative sort of pundit sphere that is anti-Israel. And those people are just getting crushed right now because everything's become totally partisan. To be conservative is to be pro-Israel. And so you're losing you like goodbye to your subscribers if you're a conservative who's not pro-Israel. I think the most successful models are, the ones where you can and I think these are all real risks, real things that readers ought to be concerned about and aware of. And the best thing you can do is just diversify as much as possible, which is to say as many different kinds of sources of revenue as possible, as many different, if you have 1 million low-dollar subscribers, that's a lot better than 2 big donors. And if you have 100 advertisers, that's a lot better than 2 advertisers. And so I think that, and then that's a totally imperfect solution. But I think if you look at successful media companies over the long term and you ask sort of like, what business are you in? Like, it's true of the New York Times. Like, what business is the New York Times in? Like, well, there's like 8 pretty decent businesses that they're kind of managing differently and separately. And if one takes a hit over here, it's not the end of the world. And that's, I think, the best place you can be. But ultimately, like, these are businesses and they're all vulnerable.
Well, I do agree when you say that there is no purity in the sense that you're right. What's the old Bob Dylan song? It's you're going to work for somebody, right? Or I think that's it's something like that, right?
Who pays the piper calls the tune.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
That and that's true and not true, but yeah.
But you're going to answer to somebody. So look, I'll confess here. I'm glad you bring this up. I will confess there are times when I think about expressing a nuanced opinion on something, or an opinion that is not easily put into one side or the other. And the thought goes through my head, I wonder how many of our subscribers will be like pissed off at me about that. And I think that's a question of a subscriber-based model. Lots of people, because of the culture we live in, a kind of tribal culture, lots of people believe that what they are subscribing to is to agree with something rather than necessarily to be challenged or periodically or selectively challenged by things, to be exposed to many different things. I mean, I think that's the kind of followership culture that we're in. So I think that's a good segue to this question of, it feels to me sometimes like we're moving backwards to an era. I'm not saying it was better or worse, but before the golden age of the daily newspaper and objectivity, putting that in quotes, there was more of the idea of the penny press, where there were lots of little media companies that were much more out there, explicit about their ideology.
They were wild.
Yeah, right, like muckraking and so-called yellow journalism, et cetera, et cetera. And the idea back then, or I don't know if it was the idea, but at least the way to say that was a good thing would be to say, well, there were lots of different voices, and so the cacophony kind of would test each individual piece of legislation or idea that would come up, would get kind of scrutinized by a bunch of different voices, and out of that would come some sort of basis of fact and truth. And it feels like, I think one way to be optimistic about the future is, are we moving back to that? Because, and before you answer, the reason I ask that is because that's a good version of it. The bad version of it is that we're all actually living in our own filter bubbles. We hear the tribal publications that we want to hear, and we don't even hear the other side. And so actually we're not being exposed to like lots of different voices at a small level. We're all kind of getting ensconced in our own individual bubbles, and there's no like basis of fact anymore. Which way do you see? Is it both and?
Yeah, I tend to be a both and guy, as you see. I think that, the people reading the hyper-partisan press of the 1830s probably were pretty deep in their filter bubbles, honestly.
Yep. Yep.
Like, you probably weren't there. I'm sure there were people who were like, well, I've read some good things and some bad things about Abraham Lincoln, but like, in fact, probably most people were getting one or the other. And they were as absolutely insane and off the wall as anything today, and more so. I guess I sort of have an observation without a real judgment that I think the overwhelming trend in media right now is just fragmentation. And there's lots of small and medium-sized things growing up. The biggest things are all shrinking. And if you think about conservative media, like used to be, like when Fox News, absolute juggernaut, totally dominant force, Megyn Kelly goes out and starts like a podcast and blog after getting tossed from NBC, and it's like you feel bad for her, basically, that like this is such a tiny thing with 1/1,000,000th the power of her old platform on Fox News. Or maybe you don't feel bad for her, depending who you are. But it's a immeasurably tiny fragment of the power she used to have. And now Fox News, obviously still the biggest one, but less powerful, less important, less dominant. Megyn Kelly, a pretty big YouTube show. Maybe she's 5% as powerful as Fox, 10%. I don't know. But like, those things have leveled. And this podcasting is like the sort of ground zero for this. And the statistic that always strikes me is that Pew surveyed, what's your favorite podcast? Obviously yours was first, but after The Lever came Joe Rogan.
Yep.
And Rogan in first place has 5% of the total. And that's a pretty weird market where the number one place in the market is 5% and everything else is smaller. Like, that's a pretty unusual kind of a media market. Usually they're much, much, much more consolidated. And so it just sort of shows, like, if I'm on the New York subway in the morning, like, I have no idea what the person next to me is listening to. Whereas if they were looking at social media, like, honestly, they're probably looking at the same tweet I am. And it's a very different ecosystem.
See, and the thing that I'm torn about is that when you say the top guy has 5% of the market, I think from a purely competition analysis of like an economy or an industry, that's good. That's sort of the way sort of Jeffersonian capitalism is supposed to work. Lots of little folks sort of competing, no one giant behemoth. But the flip side of that then becomes, well, how can any big set of information that everybody needs to have, how can any big story ever land? I was talking to a friend of mine who's on one of the big TV outlets, and this person was basically saying, look, we can report X or Y story, and even if we do it, nothing feels like it really lands anymore. That term lands, meaning it really kind of happens, a story is reported, it has staying power. It's much harder to have anything land. And the question I always come back to is, well, it's good that there's this kind of competition and cacophony, but it's also bad that like big things can happen and only a smaller and smaller, potentially in this fractured environment, a smaller and smaller potentially part of the audience will even know about it. How can you have kind of a society if nothing lands?
Yeah, we're both basically political journalists, and for whom landing means a public official takes action.
Right.
A law is passed.
Right.
Something happens, and they just don't have to the way they used to, right? Like they might pick up your story and do something, but even if it's a really big story, they just might ignore it. They used to, at least when they wanted to ignore it, say that they were going to impanel a blue ribbon commission or something. Right. Now they can just outright ignore it.
Right.
And that's really true. I mean, it's so head spinning, because I think that at the peak of sort of social media, which was 6 years ago, 8 years ago, not that long ago, stories landed with the most velocity you've ever seen.
Yeah.
That poor PR person got fired while she was on a plane because she tweeted something stupid.
That's right.
The, stories like false stories, like the Cambridge Analytica story.
Yeah.
Actually, that's the one that always sticks with me. Like descended, landed, everybody came to believe that they were true, even though they were nonsense. The stories landed too hard for a little while, I think. But I agree with you that now the sort of fragmentation and the means that the public officials in particular just have the option of ignoring everything.
Yeah, and that to me is incredibly troubling. It's in some ways it's harder to get elected without big money than it has ever been, because there is, especially at the local level, by the way, because there's so little local media, to kind of earned media, as it's called in the political world, to get your message out without essentially paid media. But it's also, once you're in office, there's so little coverage that's holding you accountable. You can just sort of tweet through it, if you will, or just kind of ignore it, just pretend it's not even happening, with the presumption that lots and lots of people won't even know. So I go back to the question of moving forward, knowing what we've just discussed about new models. How can is there evidence that new models can fill that particular void, that accountability void?
I think the answer is somewhat. I mean, I think state houses are probably the place where there are these tiny little ecosystems that can kind of be rebuilt, even though they're small. And you see some of these nonprofit state house news organizations, the Texas Tribune being the kind of first strongest one, really having an impact and forcing legislators to reckon with what they're doing. Because honestly, the dynamics of news are so weird. Having a reporter physically in your face asking you, even, is very meaningful, even if actually there's no one reading that person's work, or not a lot of people. And so to some degree, but the sort of mass power of, like, I remember a politician said some unwise things to me on an airplane, and I wrote about him in the New York Daily News, and he was very upset about it. It was the cover of the New York Daily News. It's 2006. And I think he said that Hillary Clinton, I believe he was the guy running against Hillary Clinton, and he made some really gross comments about her looks. Anyway, by not the most important accountability in the story in the world, but I just remember, like, it was like he was hit by a tidal wave.
Yeah.
Like, it didn't matter. Like, by 7 a.m. that day, every television network in the city, it was on every storefront in the city. 1 million people had read the story. Every television network was talking about it. And that you sense, I mean, honestly, in some sense, the power dynamic. You really felt I really felt like, holy crap, like, as a journalist, like, I have a lot of power. That was a lot of power we just unleashed. And he, as a Republican nominee for Senate, for better or for worse, just had absolutely no way to fight back. And that dynamic is massively shifted.
Yes, the connective tissue. I remember it growing up in Philadelphia in a different way. That there were kind of these cross media debates about the different sports teams. Some Philadelphia Eagle or Charles Barkley with the Sixers would say something on local morning radio, which would then get picked up by the news radio, which would then get picked up by the sports TV, which would then get right. It's like a kind of there's like a local conversation happening. It's not just like it's in one newspaper, as in your example. It's like there's a whole kind of local chatter that I don't feel like in a lot of ways exists much anymore. And rebuilding it, you're right, it's not that easy. But I don't want to end on a sad note. So I think, without asking you to be redundant, how about the things you are most optimistic about, and or the things that you think are potentially on the horizon that could change things for the better?
Let's see.
You're like, I got nothing.
Yeah, I think it's I don't think this stuff is going to change that fast. I think we're in like the early stages of rebuilding institutions. And it's funny you said that word institution before. I do think, like, you and I, or certainly I, came up in this sort of like post-Iraq war kind of utopian new media world where it was like, no, the job is to tear down all the institutions. They suck. And like, we're going to like free blogs and social media, and it'll be this kind of utopian outcome. And now I really think, like, oh wow, those institutions, they were pretty important. Let's try to like shore them up where we can, build new ones, recreate these communities where people trust each other. But I don't think that's like a short game. Like, I don't think there's some shortcut to that.
I want to echo that. I say that when people ask me about media all the time, I feel like everybody's been looking for a shortcut. And it's very unsatisfying, but it is reality. There really aren't shortcuts. For those who don't understand why the BuzzFeed model, or that golden era, I'm putting that in quotes, of entities like a BuzzFeed, the Huffington Post, et cetera, why that era ended? For those who don't understand anything about that, just to like give us that story or at least the top line of why those entities had a moment and what changed to end that moment.
Yeah, and I think to understand it, you have to go back a little bit, which is that there was a generation of media investors, among other things, who made their money in cable. And the basic thing that happened with cable was that these guys with wires rolled out their wires into people's homes, and to get people to pay to have the wires connected, they had to have good content. And so the wire guys paid MTV, ESPN, CNN, all this, Bravo, like this whole profusion of new programming that was really built for these wires, where you could have hour-long news programs, not 3-minute programs, where you could have more sex, where you could do all, and HBO, you could have more sort of niche programming, more adult programming, all sorts of stuff. And it was purpose-built for those wires. And the people who rolled out the cables made a lot of money, and the people who made the content made a lot of money, and everyone was happy. That's the basic cable story. You had Time Warner, the cable company, you had Time, the cable, I'm going to get all this wrong. You had Comcast, the cable company, you had Viacom, the media company. They split the winnings. Everybody's happy. And when you see this new set of pipes, this new set of wires come around, which is to say digital media and then really these big social platforms that literally the same people. The chairman of Vice had been the chairman of the founder of MTV. The chairman of BuzzFeed had been in the early days of MTV and then at Time Warner. They say, okay, we're going to run this play again, basically. And it was not an insane thing to think. You have these new pipes. They're going to need great content that's kind of purpose built for them. And the people who are making the content that the young people on these platforms like, that's shaped sort of in a way that travels right around these platforms, ultimately we're going to reach a business agreement with the Facebooks and the Googles and the Snapchats and the Twitters that they're going to have to pay us for content. And the thing they didn't really count on was user-generated content and the way in which these algorithms could take all this free stuff, and instead of you're watching garbage cable access free stuff, they would give you garbage free stuff that you wanted, and everybody would rather free than pay, And I think, we actually are now, with the convergence between TV and the internet for real, getting to places where subscription video broadcasts are starting to be a business. And I think there's elements of that is coming true, but it did not come true for sort of text-based news publishers in the way that, based on that cable metaphor, everybody involved thought it would. And part of the reason it was a golden age was because these social media systems distributed our work so broadly, and suddenly we were reaching millions of people and had all this impact. And part was because these investors had a theory of the case that did not turn out to be true, but we spent all their money along the way.
Well, it is my view, taking all of this away, that one thing that's for sure, in my view, is that if you are in the media business right now, the first and foremost thing that you need to be thinking about is how to effectively own the relationship between your audience and yourself, and that having more things in between you and your audience, and I'm thinking about, Facebook, Twitter, social media. If you're relying on Facebook, Twitter, other social media platforms as the middleman between you and your audience, and the middleman can flip a switch, change the algorithm, and make it even more difficult to talk to your audience, that's a serious problem, a serious risk for your business. That's why I do think newsletters or direct email conversations or podcasts and RSS feeds, I do think those are more valuable than ever because of social media being in the middle. I wonder if, just before you go, I wonder if you agree, like this idea that like the social media algorithm can change and just destroy a business, that how much of a problem that is.
So I agree. I mean, I absolutely agree with you. Particularly, it's very journalistically satisfying to be talking directly to your audience.
Yeah.
I like this. There's a sort of unmediated quality that is really nice. I would say if somebody comes along to you and says, hey, I'll pay the lever $1 million to put your show on Roku, even though that's like an evil middleman, you should take it. And I think the thing is, the media business is weird and complicated and always changing. And people right now, there's this conventional wisdom that you don't want to have a middleman. But of course, the movie studios have for more than 100 years had ups and downs, but you're not buying that. You're not going to a Universal-owned movie theater to watch the movie, and Universal doesn't own Netflix. Like, I think that we all just got screwed by social media, and there's now this sense that, like, you can't have middlemen. But I actually, my sort of experience in the news business is just sort of like, you need to be totally, totally pragmatic and find a bunch of different ways to scratch out enough money to pay journalists to do their work. I mean, that's sort of
for sure. We keep coming back. We keep coming back to it. It's like you want to hedge your bets by having essentially a diversified portfolio. Some direct,
because
some
David,
some,
when you endorse Donald Trump, you're going to lose a lot of subscribers, and so you're going to have to think about your other revenue streams.
Yes, that's all coming, everybody. My imminent endorsement of Donald Trump. For those who don't get the joke, Ben is joking. I'm
joking. Keep your subscriptions, double them.
Yeah, keep your subscriptions,
but also subscribe to our podcast.
Yes, and we will let everyone know where your podcast is when we do this. Ben, listen,
Thanks,
man,
David.
Thank you so much for this. I really appreciate it.
This was really fun. Thank you for having me on.
Thanks for listening to another episode of Lever Time. This episode was produced by me, Arjun Singh, with help from Chris Walker, and editing support from David Sirota, Joel Warner, and Lucy Dean Stockton. Our theme music was composed by Nick Campbell. We'll be back next week with more episodes of Lever Time.